The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Wyoming plains in hues of gold and crimson, when Amos Carter first saw her. She stood at the edge of his dusty ranch, clutching a tattered suitcase, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Amos froze, his weathered hands tightening around the reins of his horse. This wasn't what he'd expected, not at all. The townsfolk had whispered about the mail-order bride they'd arranged for him, their snickers barely concealed. He'd been lonely, sure, but he wasn't a fool. He knew a prank when he saw one. They'd sent him Clara, a woman they'd mockingly called too fat to ever be wanted, as a cruel joke. But as Amos looked into her trembling eyes, something stirred in his chest. This wasn't just a prank. This was a person. And maybe, just maybe, she was the answer to the ache he'd carried for years. Amos was no stranger to solitude. At 42, he'd spent most of his life on the sprawling Carter Ranch, inherited from his father, who'd worked the land until his hands bled. Amos had loved the quiet at first, the bleating of sheep, the rustle of wind through the sagebrush. But as years piled on, the silence grew heavy. Nights were the worst, when the stars seemed to mock his empty house. He'd tried courting once, in his youth, but the women in town wanted more than a gruff rancher with calloused hands and a heart too shy to speak. So when the local saloon boys, liquored up and smug, offered to find him a bride through a mail-order service, Amos had hesitated. Loneliness won out. He gave them his savings, every penny he'd scraped together, and trusted their promises. He should have known better. Clara arrived on a creaky stagecoach, her dress patched and her face flushed from the journey. The driver, a wiry man with a smirk, tipped his hat to Amos. "Your bride, as ordered," he said, barely hiding his amusement. The townsfolk had spread the word, they'd picked Clara because she was undesirable, a woman no one else would take. Amos overheard their jeers as he led her to his wagon. "Too fat for love," they'd said, "perfect for a fool like Amos." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Clara, though, heard every word. Her shoulders slumped, and she kept her eyes on the ground, her hands twisting the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles whitened. At the ranch, Amos showed her to a small bedroom, sparsely furnished but clean. "You can stay here," he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze. "Ain't much, but it's yours." Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." That night, as Amos lay in his own bed, he couldn't shake the image of her face, those eyes, full of fear and something else, something like hope fighting to stay alive. He knew what it was to feel unwanted. His own father had called him a disappointment, too soft for ranch life, too awkward for town. Maybe that's why he didn't send her back, despite the humiliation. Maybe he saw a piece of himself in her. Clara wasn't what the townsfolk thought. She was strong, for one thing, hauling water from the well without complaint and learning the rhythms of the ranch with a quiet determination. She wasn't schooled, but she was clever, figuring out how to mend fences and soothe spooked horses faster than Amos expected. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she told him about her life back east, a crowded tenement, a father who drank, a mother who'd died too young. "They said I'd never amount to much," she said, staring into the flames. "Said I was too big, too plain. When they offered me this chance, I thought, maybe out here, I could be more." Amos felt a lump in his throat. "You're already more," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The townsfolk didn't let up. They'd ride by, shouting taunts, leaving crude drawings nailed to the ranch gate. Amos wanted to confront them, to drive his fist into their sneering faces, but Clara stopped him. "They want you to fight," she said. "Don't give them the satisfaction." Her strength surprised him, but it also deepened his shame. He'd let her walk into this mess, hadn't he? He'd been too desperate to question their motives. One night, after a particularly cruel letter arrived and signed, calling Clara a cow and Amos a laughingstock, he found her crying in the barn. "I should go," she whispered. "I'm making your life worse." Amos knelt beside her, his voice steady. "You ain't going nowhere unless you want to. This is your home now, Clara. They don't get to decide that." The turning point came in spring, when a brutal storm tore through the ranch. Lightning spooked the herd, and half the sheep broke through a fence, scattering across the plains. Amos was ready to give up. Losing the herd meant losing the ranch, but Clara wouldn't let him. She grabbed a lantern and a rope, marching into the rain like she'd been born to it. Together, they rounded up the sheep, soaked and shivering, until every last one was safe. As they stood in the mud, breathless and exhausted, Clara laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that made Amos's heart lurch. "We did it," she said, and for the first time, he saw her smile. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Word of their teamwork spread, and the townsfolk's taunts began to falter. They saw Clara at the market, bartering for supplies with a quiet confidence. They saw Amos, once reclusive, standing taller, his eyes softer when he looked at her. The saloon boys tried one last jab, cornering Amos outside the general store. "Still stuck with that bride, Carter?" they sneered. Amos didn't swing. He just smiled, calm as the dawn. "She's more than you'll ever understand," he said, and walked away. That shut them up. Clara and Amos grew closer, their bond forged in small moments, shared meals, quiet evenings, her teaching him to read poetry, him showing her how to carve wood. He made her a chair, sturdy and wide, carved with wildflowers. She cried when he gave it to her, not from sadness but from belonging. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, Amos took her hand. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I don't care what they thought they were doing, sending you here. You're my world now. Will you stay? For real?" She squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "I've been staying, Amos. I'm not going anywhere." Years later, the ranch thrived, and so did they. The townsfolk, once cruel, now tipped their hats to Clara, who ran the ranch's books with a sharp mind and a kinder heart. Amos and Clara had a daughter, a bright-eyed girl they named Hope, who ran through the fields without fear of judgment. The townsfolk's prank had failed. They'd meant to break Amos, to mock Clara, but instead, they'd given them both a life worth living. And so, to you watching this story unfold, know this: the world can be cruel, can try to tear you down with its laughter and lies. But sometimes, in the wreckage of a joke, you find something real, something worth fighting for. Amos and Clara did. They took a cruel twist of fate and built a love that outshone the stars. Maybe you can, too. Keep going. Find your world, and hold it close.